there's one thing I also want to note. I'm going to, because we're using TypeScript, I'm just really quickly jump back into here. I'll jump back again in a sec. It doesn't, this is in JavaScript, so it doesn't actually define the type for us. I need to import their type, which is just join. And in here, well, this is where we'll define our schema, but I'll need to use this schema outside of this particular file. So I'll just start by exporting it here in this line. So here I'm going to say item schema, and then this is where I'm going to put the type in, object schema. And this is where I'll now make reference to join.object. And now it's basically kind of like just a regular JavaScript object or JSON object. I have my curly braces in the round braces. And here I'm just going to start defining things around my ID. Or around my, I'm going to use ID first, but around my object, my item. So ID is the first thing I want to validate. And I'm going to say it's a string. And just like in here, it says required, I'm going to actually do optional, just to show. Here I can say it's a string, it's an optional value, I'm not going to require it. And does it show this in the examples here? No, it does not. This is just on the default. But I can also provide validation messages. So when things are not correct, I can tell it what to respond with. So I can chain another one dot messages. And in messages, oh my goodness, I can apply like certain validations as well. So like, let's say it's an empty string, string.empty. So we say it's type string, it's optional. But let's say somebody passed me an empty string. Well, I don't want you to just pass me an empty string. Maybe there is some validation I want to have around that. And then here I'll say like item ID cannot be empty. Oh, actually, this needs to be there we go. That's better. Here. That's one value. So I have an ID, the type of string, it's an optional one. And a message I want to return is if somebody returns an empty, or somebody passes an empty string, I want it to say the item ID cannot be empty. Ian.
So then why is it required? Then why isn't it required? Is there a reason why it has to be specified as optional?
There's a difference between an empty string and not passing the parameter. So if I don't pass the parameter, I'm not going to validate an empty string. If somebody passes the ID as a value, but then they give me an empty string as a value, I don't want that. Because then it's like, then I can't tell were you intending to pass it and you just put in a bad empty string by accident, or, you know. So it's optional, but if you are going to pass it, you better pass it with something to me. Kind of what we're saying there. Good question, though. So let's do another name. I think the item had a name, and this one will say it's just going to be a string again. And this one will say it's required. Why not? Doesn't really matter for this demo. We're just showing different ways to use it. And we'll say this one has messages as well. And we'll do a specific message for required, and this is just like the prefix that I would do for if it's required. The message that I want to apply to that is name is required, I guess. Not very creative, but it's pretty clear, I think. And same idea here. If they do empty one, I just want to say name cannot be empty. The same sort of idea. Technically passing a empty parameter would suffice to say, like an empty string would suffice to say this required concept, but if it's empty, we still don't want to accept that. It needs to have some value in it. I believe we had a description in our object. And that's going to be string as well. Sorry, my wife just came home, so the dogs are excited. We'll say the description part as well. Not messages. And these will be basically the same. We'll say, if I just gonna be like identical, I'm just gonna copy these. I'm just gonna change this though. The same idea, just as long as it's required, we'll just say description is required. If they send an empty one, we'll just say it just cannot be empty. So those are some string validations we were doing there. Let's add, I don't know, we didn't have this before, but let's put a price, just so we could do like an example of a number. And we'll say the price is optional. And, oops, and we'll give it a minimum. We'll say we can't pay you, so if there's at least it needs to be 0. Can't be a negative, essentially. And we'll do this number.min. So for the minimum validation, do like price must be a positive number, positive value, number maybe is more clear. I guess, I'm not sure. And let's just add 2 more. Created at. We'll just make these ones really simple. Joy, date. Just need to make sure they're a date and updated at. Well, also joy. It's really basic validations. So really what's going on here is the joy.object is where we are basically creating our schema. This is like, I don't know, I guess you could refer to it as like the top level data structure. So this is kind of the structure that we'll expect for our request. And every field that we receive will have to basically comply or adhere with the rules we've defined now. It's not mapped to anything, so we still need to rig that up. It's just sitting here. It doesn't do anything at the moment. But once we rig it all up to work together, then we'll be able to test this out and see it in action. There's a couple things we need to do to actually set this up and use it, though. Okay, let's do this. I'm going to create another directory in V1 called types. I've created a directory called types. And I'm going to create a file in there. I'm going to call this express.t. Express? Yeah, let's call it express, because I want to do my express types. You could also maybe name it express type. Let's do that. Express types. instead of just express TS. That could be confusing. So I want to define some types that I want to use in my application here. And we are going to do this here. So let's do, I'm going to import some items here. Request, response, and next function. Press. We're going to do some customizations here. So we're going to start exporting some customs. So it's a type. I'm going to make a type called a middleware function. And that is going to be a set. And used to do our validation with. So I'm showing you guys a little bit of a fancier way to do validation, I guess. Oops. Not necessarily the required way. Or essentially what's going on here is one, I'm going to be managing later on in the validation. I'm going to be basically returning a function from the validation. And that function is going to be the next function, which will happen later on. We're creating our own express middleware. We're going to essentially do that. And that's what I need this for. Because I want to do the validation directly in my routes before it gets to my controller or anything else. So in order to do that, I need to create my own express middleware. And part of it's going to be requiring that I make use of this next function that we haven't used really yet. So that's where we're using this. The next bit is this request body. Similar concept here. What happens with record essentially is record string unknown says it's an object where the keys are strings, but the values can be kind of any type. I don't know what they're going to be. They're unknown. All I know is that the key to this object is going to be a string, and the values are open. And the reason we're doing this is we want to be able to validate the body content of the request. I know the value or the keys are going to be in string. I don't necessarily know the data type of the content of the values there. And then the request data is essentially a combo of the body. So you can see I've done a little bit of object-oriented here, where I'm saying I'm extending this request body that I've defined here, and I'm saying T extends request body. And essentially what's going on is similar concept up above. I'm just combining the request comes in, and we have been working with requests with, there's a query parameter, right? So that colon ID or something like that. There's just the queries, and so these are like I can't speak today. These are values tied into the URL that can be chained afterwards, and then the body has like our JSON content and whatnot. This will maybe be a little clearer when we start using these. You don't really need to memorize what these are. You're not going to have to create them yourself. These will just be like you can reuse this for your solution later on. Just know that it's here, and basically what I'm doing is I'm extending some of the stuff from Express, and I'm going to take these and make my own Express middleware for validation. And you'll basically be able to use this yourself. So you won't need to rewrite any of this. So I've saved this. I've made my types for middleware function for request body and request data. And I'm going to create another folder here. And it's going to be called middleware. And that is in V1 as well. And now I'm going to start trying to use these items. So I'm going to create a file called validate.ts. And this is where I'm going to actually use those custom express types and my item validation here to a degree. So import. Request, response, and next function. I need to use these from express. And then I'm also going to import the object schema. Oops, I don't need it like that. That's what I get for doing it. There we go. So I'm going to pull in the type of object schema, but I'm not going to use my specific one in here. And then I'm going to import my custom ones we just made. So my middleware function and my request data. So those are some of the things that I could create earlier. Next. Now I need to create an actual function here. This is the validate function itself. And when you see like the type P in here, basically what's going on is it's like I'm saying, that's a good word for it. I don't think about it. It's just, well, the T is basically like a convention that like represents or type, and I'm leaving the type sort of like generic here. I don't think of a good way to word this. Failing though is what I'm doing. Maybe if I kind of show it in action, I'm not sure. Doing a bad job at explaining this one right now, though. So give me a moment here. Let's fill this in first. Yeah, this will throw some things here until I fix. Oh. Let's see. Maybe I can find better wording for you guys than what I'm coming up with. Generics. If they clarify here. But essentially, a T represents just generic type. It's undefined in a sense, but it's going to be a type of object. I know the simplest words I can put forward for it. So this validate function is going to be extremely generic in that the reason why I'm using this basic type T is I'm saying I don't exactly know what I'm going to get, and I want you to be able to accept multiple types. I don't want you to be very type specific. I want you to accept objects. I don't want you to accept a type for them. It's going to receive a schema as an argument, and that schema, again, is going to be generic. I want you to be able to handle getting this schema here or another schema. It doesn't need to be item schema. It can be different ones. So I want it to be generic. The data, again, I want it to be somewhat generic. I'm not going to define it. Validate, I don't want to really know the details. I want it to just follow whatever is provided. It's going to be provided a schema and some data, and I want it to basically validate that data based off of the schema provided. So this function is very, very generic. Is maybe the only way I can really think about it. So let's do this. I'm going to use Joy's built-in validation here. So schema, because I'm using an object schema interface from Joy, saying schema, it has a built-in method on it called validate. Validate the data that's passed. I don't exactly know what this data is going to look like. It's a type, generic type parameter of data. I'm not sure, but it's going to be some sort of object, and I want you to try and validate it using this schema from Joy. There are some rules I can apply to validate from Joy here, so you can put in some options. So the value is what you're actually validating, the data, we're going to validate that. And there are some options we can pass when we're doing our validation. So, for example, if it runs into an error, it will just stop by default for the first error. But I can say something like abort early false. So now I'm saying, if you run into an error, keep validating, and I just want to see how many errors we get. And then I can provide the user all their error messages at once. And if there is an error that's returned, right? So here basically what it returns is the result of it. And it will return basically anytime there is a failure. If there's nothing wrong, then we're good to go. There's no problems. And it won't return anything, in fact. And so here, I'm going to say throw new error. If I do have an error, let's make use of this. And we're going to do a template literal here. Validation error. And here we're going to now access our error. What are the details of it? So details are going to be actually in a list that I need to, or an array that I need to start working through. Let's do this. X dot message, because there's going to be more than one. Yeah, dot join. And here I'm doing this. So they're going to be. Basically, what I'm saying is for all the errors here, or all the details in the from error, so each detail, call the map function, and this is just going to loop through all of the items in that array. And for each item in that array, grab a message attribute off of it, because I know there is one, and join them all together. Here I'm just saying, join these all together and return a string. Just making a string out of this. Join them with a comma, then a space. So I'm just basically making a comma delimited string with a space after each comma. So there may only be one. There could be more. We'll find out. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. If we do one other thing here. So basically what this does, the purpose of this is just to, what I'm doing is encapsulating any logic for validating data against a joy schema specifically. It could be different joy schemas, but I just want a joy schema. And I've encapsulated this into a singular function. It takes a schema as an argument, and then it also takes some sort of combined data request. We don't really know what it is. It's kind of not laid out for us. What's the logic going on here? I'm calling Joy's validate function here. And it validates all the data that have to be passed to it based off of the schema that it is created from. And I'm saying, if there are already errors, keep scanning, don't stop. Make sure we get all the errors. If errors exist, we want to throw a validation error message for each of the different errors found in here. There's going to be a message for each one. And if you remember, in our schema, we have messages, right? So here we have a message. I have a single message. Here I have two messages that could occur, and so on. So for every message that occurs, and FYI, I can have a message for multiple items. I want them all to be joined into a single string for output. If the validation succeeds, I don't really need any of the messaging from it. Just let everything continue happening. I'm not going to collect any sort of positive validation. I only want to know if there's any errors. So if everything passes, we just ignore it and keep moving forward. But this won't work on its own yet. I need to plug this into Express. So this is where I'm kind of setting my own Express middleware here. So do this export const validate request, and in here it's going to take a schema. Oh yeah, object schema. And this is where I'm going to start using some of that custom types that I've defined here. So here I've defined a middleware function. So I'm saying, as the return from this, please return a middleware function. And you'll see how it's used in a moment here. Right now it's complaining because I'm not returning anything here. So let's do that. I'm actually going to start with the return. And return itself is a function. So I'm defining a function here. And this is where I'm going to use request. I'm going to use response. This is where I'm going to use next. And this function is going to do it's going to try to do some stuff. So what's it going to try to do? It's going to take, it's going to try to create a data. So we're going to try and create our own request payload here, or capture the request payload, I should say, actually, from the middleware itself. So this is going to look a little funky at first. I'm going to go dot. Start. Okay. Stop. Browse. Then I'm going to call my validate function. And I'm going to pass it that schema and this data. And then I'm going to call next. And we're going to catch some generic errors right now. And if there is an error, we're going to return a status 100 JSON from that, which includes error. And we're going to do this. Okay. So let me explain a little bit what's going on here. When we are in our routes, or controllers actually, that would be a better explanation. Let's go into that controller really quick. Each controller receives request, response, and next. And when you make your requests to, like, say, a route, like get all items, or better yet, create item, we can get like the request body of that. Or I can do something like get the request params off of that. What I'm saying here is this has access as a middleware function. When we use it in our middleware, which we haven't done yet, but when we use it as middleware, it will have access to the request, the response, and the next function as middleware. Each middleware will have that available to it. I'm saying, take this custom object I made, get the body, the params, and the query, and throw it all into this one from the request. What I want to do is to be able to collect any value that comes as part of my request. So whether it's the parameters, whether it's the query, or whether it's the body, I want to be able to take that and validate it all at once against my schema. So if you happen to have sent maybe like in the update item, if it happens to have sent the ID as part of the params and then the rest of the object as part of the body, right? Even though it's one item and the ID is in one part and then the name and description's in another part, smack it all together for me. Is what I'm saying? Throw it all as a data object and just validate it all against our schema. Then, once you've done the validation, if everything worked, if the entire validation worked and we didn't run into any errors that we threw, this here is the built-in next function from Express that basically says, okay, call the next middleware line, is what goes on here. This happens behind the scenes with Express. I know this probably sounds a little confusing and not terribly, you might be like, Dave, this is like ridiculous. Why would you expect us to do this? You're not going to be expected to do this. This is a tool now that you'll be able to use, and I'll show you how to use it. But maybe first we should take a breather. We'll take 10, and then we can see this actively working. And kind of go through step by step to see it work itself. So let's stop for a break for 10 minutes, and we will basically put a breakpoint in our code once we set this up, and I'll step through it running so we can get a better idea of what's happening. So let's do 111. Let's see here, just looking at our questions in the chat. Akeem, object-oriented programming help us simplify how we go about APIs. No, I don't know. I don't know what's simplifying anything. It's a way we can go about doing our coding in a particular fashion for creating an API. Wouldn't necessarily simplify it or not. Dante, for this assignment, are we continuing where assignment 2 stopped, or is this a separate assignment? So in this